All right, guys. So we are going to be going over stress and stress adaptations today. So what we're going to focus on is kind of how the body responds to stress, what is stress, the defining principles of stress, and kind of go from there. All right. So lecture overview: what is stress? The history of stress research, evolution of stress management, stress and the role it plays, and then tools to manage stress. So very simple, all about stress and how we can utilize that to become better coaches. So, what is stress? Originally said to be arousal shift in a set of internal steady state conditions termed homeostasis away from stable habituated set points. And this was sought out by Walter Cannon in the 1920s. So, the idea of homeostasis, right, is the idea that our body is getting away from its set point, and then it has to create these stable environments to bring it back to said set point. And when it comes to homeostasis, a lot of people equate it to like the thermostat of your air condition, right? If you have it on 74 and it's at 74, but you want it to get a little bit cooler, you put it down to 70. It's going to take a little bit to get to 70, but once it gets there, that's homeostasis for it, right? And then Hans Selye in 1936 stated that stress is the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change, right? So the idea that any type of stress is going to create some type of demand for your body to change. He also switched attention from the catecholamines of the adrenal medulla, which was first pronounced as far as stress mechanisms go, and switched it over to glucocorticoids of the adrenal cortex, which is also known as cortisol. So stress, cortisol, they're interrelated. And he came up with what is known as general adaptation syndrome, GAS, which is called the alarm phase, the resistance phase, and the exhaustion phase, right? And if you think about it in terms of strength training, they put it in this nice, convenient model, even though this was not built for strength training. I cannot emphasize this enough. General adaptation syndrome was built for um, biological changes within the body. So, innoxious environments that can create death. Last time I checked, no one's dying from training, especially no powerlifters. But it does present this nice curve for the alarm phase, which brings you down. Then you have this resistance phase. And then you have, if you resist for too long, then you have exhaustion, which results in death. Then in 1988, Sterling and Iyer embraced the multidisciplinary insights and proposed the concept of allostasis, right? And that is the process by which the body responds to stressors in order to regain homeostasis. So every training session is an acute bout of stress, along with lifestyle stress and our perception of that stress. And that is termed the allostatic load, right? So there's a lot of dynamic principles that go into stress. Whereas before with the general adaptation syndrome, it only focused on one confounding variable that caused stress. So allostasis suggests that organisms maintain physiological stability by anticipating needs before they arise and by mobilizing a diverse breadth of neurological, biological, and immunological accommodations to counter these emergent challenges. So, in theory, suggests that when challenged, entangled networks of neural and biological collaborators orchestrate responses that deploy arrays of systemic mediators modulated through densely interconnected nonlinear feedback and feed-forward linkages. Right? It's a constant, firmly positions. In contrast, right? It firmly positions the brain as the master organ responsible for orchestrating all central and peripheral responses to impose challenges. This was not thought of before within the gas principle. It was thought that the brain really didn't have a confounding response to stress, and that it was mostly mediated by the actual stressor. So this makes a little bit more sense when you think about dynamics of stress and stress management, and then also the understanding of the brain and its role as the governor and central nervous system. So the brain is the key organ of stress processes that determines what individuals will experience as stressful. It orchestrates how individuals will cope with stressful experiences, and it changes both functionally and structurally as a result of stressful experiences. The amygdala and the basal ganglia are the first to register the challenge. They mediate accommodative responses and are the first networks to exhibit neuroplastic wear and tear subsequent to unalleviated load. Right. So there's not a specific set of tightly controlled homeostatic conditions that must be defended, but a collaborative effort of many processes, right? So allostatic allostasis is thinking about many different collaborators that induce stress, whereas the general adaptation syndrome was only thinking about one confounding one. So Cell's work was done in rats, and they looked at stress as things that stimulate the general adaptation syndrome. Understand that these rats, it took 30 days for them to involate their thymus. And if you think about research with rats, right, 30 days of a rat's life is probably equivalent close to 10 years of a human's life. So it's hard to extrapolate some of those things a lot of times. Introducing severe stressors and suggested they had a common trait of being noxious, which means death, killing, toxic. He could never identify the common mediator that facilitated changes in homeostatic set points in response to the environment. Couldn't find it, but yet confounded it the entire time. Current research looks at individual differences in cognitive and emotional responses due to stressors. So the evolution of stress and stress research, Sterling and Ayers presented allostasis, which proposes that the central nervous system exerts control over all physiological regulator responses to environmental demand in the alert, intact organism. And then in 1993, McEwen and Steller introduced the concept of allostatic load, which is the physiological cost of making long-term adaptive shifts across a broad range of systems to match internal function to environmental demand. Lisa Barrow-Feldman also goes into this. She's a neuroscientist, and she talks about the idea that we have a body budget, and that every time we're stressed or every time we're induced with some type of stressor, that's part of the budget that it takes away. And we have to either replace that with something to create more budget for us, or the budget continues to get taken away, right? So we want to make sure that we're thinking about that, right? If we start to put stress upon us, and that can be training, that can be poor sleep, that can be poor food choices, that can be a bad relationship, right? We have to be able to replace that with something, or it's going to continue to take away, take away, take away. And that's a lot of detrimental downfalls to continue to have stress, chronic stress pull at you. So allostasis allows ongoing evolution of the match between internal resources and external demands. It permits organisms to produce physiological adjustments in advance of need through anticipatory arousal. It also allows the organism to adapt to circumstances over time, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that the idea is that we're able to build resilience as human beings, and that we're able to eventually adapt over time if we're able to control those other stresses, right? So say we have a program that we're doing, and 3 weeks it just beats us up and we're like, I got to deload. And then your coach asks you, well, okay, how's your stress? How's your sleep? How's your nutrition? You're like, well, I'm getting about, one day I'll get 1,000 calories in, the next day I'll get like 8. And then, I'm not hydrated, my sleep's poor, and I have finals this week. It's like, okay, well, let's start to knock out some of this stuff and build up better habits. And then all of a sudden, that same program that destroyed you in 3 weeks, you can now do for 8 to 10 weeks, right? So that's kind of the idea, that our body is able to adapt to these circumstances over time. It doesn't mean that changes aren't made and our body adapts. Changes have to be made in order for you to do that body budgeting. It also predicts the responses of an alert, intact organism existing in a changing ecological framework. So stress and the role it plays. A meta-analysis by Arvarson et al. Concluded that a prior history of elevated psycho-emotional stress was a strong predictor of injury occurrence, right? So if the person came to the gym stressed from, maybe he had an argument with his girlfriend, he's going to be more likely to occur injuries throughout that session than a person who is not. So understanding those dynamics by talking to that person, asking them how their life's going, communicating will allow you to either change the model that you have them currently doing, or you can implement some things to de-stress them before the training stimulus. Performance has been shown to suffer as well due to high stress reactivity and a low stress resilience compromises cardiovascular and maximal power training adaptation, right? So the person's inability to adapt to stress, maybe because they've never really inoculated themselves to stress. And then the fact that they finally did, they're not able to adapt to it, or that they're overly stressed and their willpower and their desire to deal with stress is down as well. It downregulates the immune system, motor coordination, cognition, mood, metabolism, and hormonal health. It can also, chronic and acute stress can play a negative role on performance outcomes and health outcomes, imposing an additional pre-training emotional load, increased perceived exertion, and diminished physical performance in competitive athletes. And then localized neurochemical changes subsequently customize the cascade of downstream biochemical and hormonal responses mobilized to cope with the anticipated challenge. In essence, emotion calibrates the chemistry of the stress response to perceived context. So, some tools to overcome stress, right? These are going to be important drivers and important things that you can implement to help with stress, right? So, thinking about subjective assessments, your ability to understand through either talking to the individual or questionnaire or some type of self-rating metrics, like an RPE, will allow you to better assess where that athlete is, how that athlete's feeling, and what kind of exercise that athlete should be doing. The autonomic nervous system is a huge regulator of emotional state. Heart rate variability provides a biologically oriented indicator of current stress conditions. So, understanding that your autonomic nervous system, your ability to inoculate yourself to stress. So, if high stressful situations occur, you're able to decompartmentalize and bring that stress down very, very fast. So, think about it in a weight training session, right? Yeah, that's a stressful environment. You're also, maybe it's a heavier day, maybe it's a higher intensity day. So, you're more psyched up to get there, you're more sympathetically aroused. Then, as soon as that session's over, being able to calm down and get into a parasympathetic state, that's your an autonomic nervous system. That's your heart rate variability in place. So the better you can do that, the better you're going to be able to control stress. The coach's ability to read the athlete's body language and dialogue can be another great indicator of the athlete's state. So if the athlete walks in with their head down, or if they're usually very excited and they come up and give you a fist dab, something, a hug, and they're just not that anymore, big sign, big red flag to really deload that athlete's stress that day. So maybe reduce RPE, maybe change the plan to do more active recovery work. Being able to regulate those things and auto regulate those things are going to be very important. Our beliefs and expectations of the acute bout of stress can play a role as to whether or not it has a positive or negative effect on our allostatic load. A research group led by Mose et al. 2017 took 76 subjects and found that habitual expectations demonstrated greater psychological benefits, enjoyment, mood increase, anxiety reduction, and greater increases of alpha 2 power, right? Some recent research demonstrated the idea that squats and deadlifts produce the same amount of fatigue, yet people still feel more fatigued when they deadlift. And one of the theories behind that is that deadlifts just feel harder, right? They feel harder. They're in your hands. Your hands feel very stiff afterwards. And there's just this feeling like they're a harder lift, even though they produce the same amount of fatigue. Psychologically, they feel like they're a harder exercise. So that in and of itself is going to create more stress on the person. So being able to think about that and how you're going into these things and how you're going into your training sessions, what mindset you have, can play a huge role on how hard that stress is going to hit you on that day. Um, Literature shows that for the same external stressor, subjects feel less subjectively stressed, activate less of a stress response, and are less at risk for stress-related disease if they feel a sense of control. right? So if that person has control of the situation, if that person only focuses on the things they have control over instead of the things they don't, then that person's ability to perceive that stress is going to be exponentially greater in a more positive outlook. Breath work is another great tool to add in along with mindfulness. Beliefs and expectations, size monitor changes in brain states, induce arousal, and reset breathing variability. Those behavioral roles homeostatically regulate breathing, stability under physiological and pathological conditions. So the idea is that your breath controls your autonomic nervous system. You can use breath work to create arousal and be sympathetically driven. You can use breath work to create parasympathetic drive. So that's something that you want to look into, you want to think about in terms of how your athletes breathing. Are they doing breath work? How often are they doing it? And what are those conditions that they're doing it under? And then viewing the morning sunrise, something as simple as going on a 5 to 10 minute walk first thing in the morning is the most powerful way to properly time cortisol release. And also by viewing the sunset reinforces that circadian rhythm and preps the melatonin pathway for release and sleep induction. While walking, making sure that you use side to side eye movement while looking out to the horizon can help lower stress and anxiety, which was done by Davison and Parker, 2001. So those are some of the tools that you can do to start to overcome some of these stressful environments. Some other ones: avoiding any bright light from the hours of 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. So the bright lights, the sun, the walking, that's working with a lot of your neurotransmitters, your dopamine, your serotonin, to help create less stressful environments and also to help get you into better sleep and better moods throughout the day. So if we can regulate those dopamine, serotonin pathways, then we can start to feel better throughout the day. Blue light blockers can help with that. You can use an app like Flux on your computer to reduce blue light exposure. This can help regulate dopamine in a positive way. Certainty versus skepticism versus self doubt completely alters brain chemistry, as does reward versus punishment. To get the fastest results, an athlete must buy into the program with absolute certainty and learn to view the process as a reward, not punishment, or something they have to do, understanding that the best and fastest way to learn is to fail. And with each failure exposure, more neuroplasticity happens. So shifting their mindset to think of failure as a good thing over a bad thing is something that's going to be very positive in them to actually learn those skills that you're trying to teach them. And it's going to create a less stressful environment. So when you're teaching someone to do a lift and they're getting frustrated with that lift because they're maybe not getting it, right? This happens a lot with Olympic liftings or very high complex movements. Letting them know that, hey, right, research shows that the more times you fail, the more neuroplasticity you're going to have. So failure is not necessarily something that we're trying to obtain, but if we do fail, it's not a bad thing either. That's only our ability to continue to adapt and continue to work and continue to thrive and get better by neuroplasticity, right? We're introducing new things that are hard, which is going to cause us to fail. We're not going to get it right away, but those failure bouts is what's causing that neuroplasticity to happen. So that's what they should be focusing on in and of itself. So the idea of stress and stress management is something that we should always be thinking about in terms of how to set up our programs, understanding what our athletes are going through within their week, within their month, and being able to orchestrate a program based on that. So we want to get away from this idea that this program is the way they're going to go and there's no adjustments to it. And it's not based off of that person's upcoming schedule or their upcoming stressors or the stressors that they have going on in their life. If you're not continuously adjusting and reaching out to your client to fix some of these stress ideas, then you're never going to make progress. Their rate of injury is going to go through the roof, and it's going to be a frustrating situation for both you guys. So understanding stress and the mechanisms that cause it and the ideas behind it can be helpful. It can also be overwhelming and daunting. So if you guys have any questions about stress and stress management, please ask them below.